Welcome to Spotlight. I'm your host, Amitha. Join me weekly to get inspired by guests who are making positive changes in this world. Our guest today is a Pulitzer-Prize-nominated Canadian journalist with special interests in science and spiritual philosophy, the arts, and world history. It's my pleasure to welcome to our show, Mr. Barry Brown. It's amazing to have you here.
Oh, well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm honored too.
Well, we are so excited to be talking about your recently published book. But before we get into that, tell us a little bit more about your background, upbringing, education.
Sure. Well, I was born in Toronto, raised here. Used to spend a lot of time in the woods, in the back of my house, in my neighbor's house, building tree forts and things. Always had an interest in nature. I got into writing fairly early when I was a teenager, writing and politics. At my junior high school, they were sending girls home for wearing pants. So I ran for student council president, and when I was elected, they stopped doing that.
Nice, congrats.
Thank you. So I had an interest in politics, and I studied yoga and different philosophies, became a vegetarian when I was younger, and basically had a lot of interest in a lot of different areas. I published my first poems when I was in high school, and my first play was produced when I was a teenager.
Wow, that's amazing. As a teenager, I remembered my main concern was, okay, what am I going to wear to school today? How are my nails looking? And look at you, we're already making changes in the world. That's great. And so it looked like you were already connecting with life, with nature, with world right from the get-go. And it's no surprise you're here where you are today because of that, because of the passions.
Oh, thanks.
So let's start off earlier on in your career.
Sure.
So I understand you have been part of like theater management.
Yes.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more.
Well, actually, theater management is what got me into journalism. I was working at Second City Theater, you know, the comedy theater, and I was there as theater manager. So one day I met this gentleman, Bob, who plays on Sesame Street, or the old show Sesame Street,
yes,
the children's show.
I remember Sesame.
So he was Mr. Bob. And Bob invited me, and he said, if you're ever down in New York, why don't you come by the studio where we do the show? So I was down in New York, staying with a friend of mine. And as I was about to leave to go visit the studio, she said to me, you know, at the time, you're not published, you know, poet, novelist, screenwriter. Why don't you try journalism? So I bought myself a notepad and a pen, went down, and he said, okay, go ahead. There's Kermit, there's the producer, it's all yours. So I went around and I started interviewing people. And at the end of the day, when I was leaving, Bob said to me words that I always kept close to my heart. He said, you did more in the time that you were here than anybody I've seen. You've got a real talent and you should use it. So I was very flattered. I came back, I pitched my story to the Star. They said, well, take a look at it. So I wrote it up having no idea what I was doing, and they rejected it. So I begged and pleaded and said, please give me another chance. And I said, all right, you know, don't worry about the length. We can always cut it, you know, if it's not good enough. So then I went back, called Bob for some more information. And since I didn't have any training as a journalist, I just thought, well, let me see if I can tell the story in the same way I would tell you if I was saying, oh, you know what happened when I was in New York? So I wrote the story, brought it down, and this time the editor looked at it and said, sold. And that was my first piece. And after that, I called Bob and said, what Canadians do you know that are living in New York that might interest the media up here? So he introduced me to some other people. Next article I sold to the Globe and Mail, and my career began.
Wow, that's great. I love the fact that you didn't take a rejection and stop there. You went further, and that's such a great learning lesson. Like failure is often the first step to success, and you have to just keep persisting just like you did.
Well, it's not really failure, is it? I mean, you wouldn't call it failure if you were practicing to do something, because it's just practice. You know, you need to, there's an old saying that says you learn more from failure than you do from success. That's why I'm very smart and intelligent, because I failed a lot.
And that's great. You put a positive spin on things. Like you said, it's not, don't call it failure.
No.
You learn along the way.
It's a learning.
But not everybody has that mindset, and so that's why not everybody is where you're at. I'm going to take, actually, so yes, that's great. You you know, delved right into the world of journalism. But just taking a step back, understand with the theater production that came along, later on, you also went on to host and produce some variety shows. Can
Yes.
you shed some light on that?
Sure. I ran a show for about 2 years, year and a half, 2 years, called Maximum Cabaret, where I gave a lot of stage time to new talent in the city. So I arranged it like the old vaudeville or variety shows. So I had 2 music acts, 2 comedy acts, poetry, and spoken word. So in the time, I ran through more than 300 different talents. A lot of people who got their first shot on my stage. Sean Majumder, for example,
yeah?
one of the first
Wow.
times that he
I know
performed was in my show, which is several times actually. So it was very good. I got to see a lot of interesting talent. I'd go out in a tuxedo and I'd introduce them and give them the opportunity to practice their talents and showcase their talents on my stage.
Wow, I'm so honored to be sitting next to such a colorful personality, who goes right into all the different walks of life. So all along the way, were you solo? Did you have support from your friends, family?
To some extent, not so much support from my family. I had one of those families that weren't terribly supportive, but I did have a lot of friends. And they encouraged me in what I was doing. And in fact, one time, I also did some stand-up comedy. And the very first time I did stand-up comedy, I'm probably the only person whose first appearance on stage I had in the audience the assembled international media, because they were all friends of mine as a journalist at that point. So I had, as I remember, the Wall Street Journal was there, the Chicago Tribune, the Associated Press, and a few others who were watching my show. And after I performed for my first open mic show, the host grabbed me as I exited the stage and said, "I want to hire you," and paid me $5 for my very first show the next week or something. So.
Awesome. This is so great. Everything is coming together because you put it out to the universe and it was all coming together. And fast forward, we enter the world of journalism.
Yes.
We're going to talk more about that. But before that, it's time for a short break. Welcome back to Spotlight. We are talking to the Pulitzer-Prize-nominated Canadian journalist, Mr. Barry Brown. So it's great, Barry. The background you gave us is so inspiring. You just went after everything that your heart desired, and you're here today. So now tell us about all your experience in the world of journalism.
Well, journalism was very interesting for me because it was the first time I really got to write for a living, which is what I wanted to do. Starting when I was about 16, that was my focus. I wanted to be a writer. And I started off with writing poetry and some plays, but it wasn't really making me a living. And so then I started off, as we were talking about, with my first work in Canada. But again, it was sort of a small market, working as an independent. So I decided at some point that I wanted to start working as a Canadian correspondent and bureau chief for American and other international newspapers. But I had no idea how to go about it. As it happened, I met the gentleman who was the Washington Times bureau chief here at the time, James Morrison. He and I became friends, and shortly afterwards he was called back to Washington to cover Congress, and he recommended me to replace him. So they became my first client, and as I started to realize that the stories I was writing about Canada, because I understood Canadian politics and culture better than most of the Americans who were up here for a couple of years as a bureau chief, because I grew up here, they liked my work very much. So I started pitching my stories to other newspapers and news organizations of the States. And after a while, I eventually worked for over 100 of them, all across the United States, ended up writing 3,000 plus stories over the years. And had a wonderful time doing it. Met a lot of incredibly interesting people, learned a lot of stuff about, pretty much everything. Because as we were talking before, I have a wide range of interests, pretty much everything except sports.
Well, I'm telling you, if you put your mind to it, you will cultivate interest in it too, because you go after everything, because you love, it sounds like you love world life. And is that how it naturally segued into you being having your first book?
Yes.
Yeah, so again, congratulations to you. So it's called Humanity, the World Before Religion, War and Inequality. What an interesting title. So tell us, first of all, what inspired you to start writing the book?
Well, The book is really, it starts off noting the fact that there's actually no evidence of organized human war anywhere on Earth before about 6,000 years ago. So my book is really the first ever to look at history as the two-part story of one human family. How we managed to create a common civilization of travel, trade, and language in the 99.9% of history before the First War, and then the First War and how its consequences led to the modern world. I came into it because of an obscure quote from Aristotle.
Okay.
So the quote said, Aristotle said, the Jewish people are descended from the Brahmin priests of ancient India. Now, this fascinated me because my background is Jewish, and for about 3 years when I was a young man, I was a Hare Krishna monk. I lived in the temple, studied the Vedas and Sanskrit, and I was initiated as a Brahmin. So I was really curious to know whether the old guy was right or not. Now, I'm not particularly a religious person, but I am an investigative reporter. So the first thing that I did was look at the Jewish Bible to see if there was anything in there that might give this idea some credibility. Okay? So it says in the text, the human history in the Jewish Bible starts with the story of the Garden of Eden. Now, according to the book, Eden is in the eastern part of a larger land called Havilah. So then I go, okay, so where was Havilah? So I turned to the 1906 20-volume Jewish Encyclopedia, which tells me that the oldest traditions in Judaism and Christianity, going back more than 2,000 years, all agree that this larger land, Havilah, was India. So our Jewish calendar begins about 6,000 years ago. So my next question was, what could possibly have happened in India 6,000 years ago that changed history so much that it was almost like creating a new race of people? Okay? So what happened 6,000 years ago was the Kurukshetra War. So then the question became, was this the world's first war? Is this what Garden of Eden actually referred to? Was the change? Because, you know, if you look at almost every ancient civilization, they all have a story about a time before war and then after war. So that started about 8 years of research to look into this, to see if there was genetic trail that went from the earlier ancestors of the Jewish people called the Hebrew people, where we get the name of the language from. And it turns out that the Hebrew people come out of the Indus River Valley, and you can trace the genetic heritage back there, you know? So that started it, and then as I said, 8 years later, I finished my book.
Wow, that is quite, you know, intricate and detailed. What did all this research involve? Was it you just going through the documents that were already, you know, in the libraries, or did you actually have to go into the field and investigate?
I talked with a lot of experts in a lot of areas because you can find things out there in existing books and in older texts that talk about similarities between Jewish traditions and certain Jewish symbols, like the Star of David, for example, that echo into ancient Indian culture, right? But nobody seemed to have put the whole thing together as to why that is. They just thought, well, maybe there was a little cross-pollination going on. When I started to see that the Hebrew people came from India, then I had to do all of this research into it to see whether everything matched. If you could trace the early stories of the Jewish Bible, the ones you could look at from the outside. So if Eden was the war, the next thing that happens is the Noah story that has something that you can look at. So the Noah story takes place about 2000 BC, and that's the time when the Indus River Valley falls. And the Noah story is about migration from some place in the east that's unidentified into the Middle East and Mesopotamia. So when you start to do the genetic trail, you start to find, look, that's where they came from. And then you trace it up to the disappearance of the Hebrew people in our book, which is the Exodus story. And then I talked to a lot of different people because I was not an expert. So, for example, I got in touch with Dr. Mayak Vahaya at the Tata Institute for Fundamental Research in Mumbai. He's an expert on the Indus River Valley, and I found a PDF that he had written that talked about the demographics of India 6,000 years ago, which I needed to know. Thank God for the internet, right? So I then got in touch with him, and I said, here's my thinking of what the Indus was about. And he was fascinated by it, because one of the people who investigate the Indus can tell you things about it, but they don't know why it is what it is. And what seemed to me is that if you look at the Indus as coming after the Vedic period, not before, then everything starts to make sense because they're reacting to all the things that caused the war. That's why they had no palaces, no temples, no warriors, none of these things, even the horses that they used to have, they abandoned them because they all related back to the Vedic period. My thinking is that they are inspired by Krishna, not as a god, but as the wisest man of his period. And I think that they look at Krishna's instruction in the Gita when he's talking to Arjuna, and he says, abandon all of these things, that they take it to mean give up all of the class divisions and these things that caused social conflict and led to the war, which is why they don't have any of those things. And then it suddenly makes sense. So Dr. Mayank Vahaya was fascinated by this, and we have had conversations for the last 8 years about it, and he's come around to my way of thinking, basically.
Wow. I just love your investigative process, and it's no wonder you were nominated for the Pulitzer Prize.
Thank you.
There's more to find out about you, but before that, it's time for a short break. Welcome back to Spotlight. We are talking to the trailblazer, Mr. Barry Brown. So Barry, this is great. We're getting to know of you as a journalist, as a published author. I also know that you have been an invited speaker to many organizations and institutions. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, probably one of the most interesting speaking engagements that I had was I was invited to address the law school at the State University of New York in Buffalo. And I got the invitation because I was the Toronto bureau chief for the Buffalo News at the time. And I was covering a lot of stories that Canada, about hate mongers in Canada. And of course, as some people may know, we have laws that restrict hate mongering. I mean, you can think what you want on your own and talk to your friends, but if you start to try and promote hate at large, that's against the law. Now, some people consider this to be a restriction on free speech, as in the United States. They have no such laws, for the most part. I got to talking with the head of the law school there, who I would in Buffalo, in New York, because I wanted always to get comparative Canadian and American reactions since my audience was in the United States. So he asked me one time what I thought about the law, and I said I basically support it. I thought it upheld Canadian values, and I didn't see it as a terrible restriction on free speech any more than pollution laws are on the use of chemicals. You know, you can use them where you want, but you don't want to dump them in the street. Okay? So he thought that was interesting, and he ended up inviting me to be the only non-lawyer on a panel of 4 that were addressing the law school, which included 2 American lawyers and 2 panel of 5. 2 Canadian lawyers, 2 American lawyers, and me, the odd man out.
The expert.
Yeah, exactly. So, so I got a chance to talk about it. My talk was very well received, and the talk was published in the Law Review, and it has since been used quite often as a teaching tool in universities and colleges here and in the United States.
Nice. That's why you know why I call you a trailblazer. Yes,
down
you are. Wow. We heard not sports, but everything else you delve into.
I actually did do sports a couple of
times.
In fact, my first story for the New York Times was the fan reaction in Toronto when the Toronto Blue Jays won the World Series for the first time. And I was very proud of that because I don't really have a big interest in sports, but I still got to do that historic story.
See, I tell you, if you put your mind to it, even if it's sports, you will do it.
Yes.
So now let's digress for a bit. Wow, you do so much. But what about time for yourself? Do you have any hobbies where you relax, chill time?
Yes, absolutely. I have a great interest in film and music and the arts, generally, like art galleries. I have ambitions to do some painting and sculpting on my own someday. Nice. My companions right now are my 2 cats who come with me on walks, not on a leash, they just follow me. And as a result, I'm the only cat owner with street cred among the dog people. And I've taught them to be very friendly. People talk about it. Once they know you, if I've introduced them to you, then on their own, when it doesn't matter if I'm around. If they see you walking down the street, they'll come up and say hello and go, hi, meow, no. So more people in the neighborhood tend to know my cats than know me.
Wow. Every part of your life is so disciplined and goal-oriented, even your hobbies and even with your cats. That's amazing. So there's no stopping you really, Barry. So what's next for you?
Well, actually, I've been in discussions with some people about taking elements of my book that tie together the Garden of Eden story with the war at Kurukshetra in the Mahabharata, and we're looking at developing that into a stage play, possibly a musical.
Nice.
So that's one area that we're looking at, and possibly also making a documentary on my book showing how humanity was one family in the beginning and how we divided afterwards.
Nice. And we are looking forward to that. And, it's a good interpretation. It's nice to see your side of the interpretation, especially because you're so evidence-based and investigative. Love it.
Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you today, Barry, because you do so much and you have inspired us a lot. But I would request you, if you have some, unique words of advice for our viewers, it would be great.
Sure. Well, I guess, looking at human history over this long period of time, if there's one lesson that I think we can take from this, it's that you can accomplish more working with other people and together than you do working on your own. Because that's how we created civilization, was working together, not in separate groups battling each other. And I think that that's the whole nature of life, is, the desire to come together and build together.
Well, very well said, and I love the fact that you practice what you preach as well. Thank you so much for talking to us. Once again, congratulations on your book.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Well, that was Mr. Barry Brown, who has inspired us to make a positive impact in the world by working together. Well, that's a wrap for this week's show. Thank you for watching us. Continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and write to us at spotlight@ethnicchannels.com. Until next week, this is Amitha signing off, encouraging you to embrace history and focus on life at present.